Have you ever heard a sound so wrong it chills your bones? For me it was a knock, a simple rhythmic tapping lost in the fury of a storm. But this was no ordinary knock, and the man who made it was no ordinary visitor. The year was 1973, October, and the Yorkshire moors were drowning in relentless rain. My cousin Miriam and I, both 19, were alone in a cottage meant to be our rustic escape. The storm had killed the lights, leaving us with only candlelight and a growing sense of dread. We were miles from the nearest village, isolated by the storm. Then, through the wind and rain, we heard it tap, tap, tap. At first it was almost shy, but it grew louder, more insistent. Who would be out on a night like this? Miriam and I exchanged a terrified glance as the knocking came again, louder. The horrors of the storm were no longer just outside, they wanted to be let in. And so began the longest night of our lives. The cottage was ancient, built from the same brooding stone as the moors themselves. Inside, the air was thick with damp and wood smoke, the furniture heavy and old. That night it felt less like a home, and more like a trap. The village of Blackwood Mire was 5 miles away, but the storm made it feel unreachable. The phone was dead, the radio silent. We were truly cut off. No one knew we were in trouble, and something was knocking on our door, having braved the storm to find us. The knocking stopped, and for a moment we hoped it was over. But then it returned, louder, more demanding. Knock, 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 no sane person would be out in this weather. Miriam called out, "Who's there?" Her voice trembled, but she stood firm. Silence answered, then the latch on the door moved. Impossible, since it could only be lifted from inside. We both saw it shift, a soft click echoing in the room. The knocking returned, now with a low, scraping noise, like fingernails dragging down the wood. We stood frozen, eyes fixed on the door, fear rooting us in place. The storm outside was nothing compared to the terror now inside our walls. The door was old, but suddenly it felt far too thin. Something was testing it, probing for a way in. The air was thick with dread. We waited, breathless, for what would come next. "Please," a man's voice called, calm and polite. "I need to use your telephone, my car has broken down." The normalcy of his request was the most terrifying part. Miriam, torn between fear and duty, replied, "The line is dead, the storm knocked it out." She peered through the peephole, then recoiled, face white as chalk. "He's not wearing any shoes," she whispered. "And his clothes, they're not wet." I looked. The man stood in the rain, barefoot, in an old suit, his face pale and eyes blank, staring through the door at me. There was no desperation, just emptiness. This was no stranded traveler. I pulled Miriam away from the door, heart pounding. The impossible details hung in the air. Bare feet, dry clothes, that hollow gaze. We retreated to the fireplace, as far from the door as we could get. The storm raged, but the real threat was now at our threshold. We waited, terrified, for his next move. "Just let me in for a moment," the voice insisted, still polite but now edged with menace. We huddled by the fire, silent, hoping he would leave. But the feeling of being watched was overwhelming, as if his eyes could pierce the door. The door handle began to turn, jiggle, jiggle, jiggle. He was testing the lock, trying to get in. "Please," he said again, but now the voice was cold, flat. A command, not a request. It sounded closer, as if it was inside the room with us. We spun around but saw only shadows and felt a third presence, drawn in by our fear. The knocking resumed, harder, faster, a frantic drumming that echoed our racing hearts. The cottage felt smaller, the walls closing in. We realized there was nowhere left to hide. The pounding on the door became violent, the wood splintering around the lock. We shoved a table against it, a futile barrier. Suddenly everything stopped, an unnatural silence fell. Then from the hallway behind us came the wet sound of bare feet on stone. Squelch, squelch, squelch. Miriam, driven by terror or bravery, grabbed a candlestick and ran toward the sound. "Get out!" she screamed, vanishing into the darkness. I heard a thud, then a gasp of surprise, and then nothing. Silence, deeper than before. I called her name, but there was no answer. The storm outside was distant, the real storm was inside. Miriam was gone. I was alone. I forced myself to search the hallway, poker in hand, candle trembling. The back door was still bolted, bedrooms empty. Miriam had vanished. Then I saw them. Wet footprints, perfectly formed, leading from the back door to where she disappeared. They stopped in the middle of the corridor, no return, no other prints, just the barefoot man's impossible trail. I spent the rest of the night huddled by the fire, eyes fixed on the darkness. Dawn brought silence and emptiness. The doors were still locked, but Miriam was gone. When the police arrived, they found only me, shaken and alone. My story was met with disbelief, but I knew what I had seen. The barefoot man had taken her. The search for Miriam turned up nothing, no trace, no clues. My account was dismissed as hysteria, the barefoot man a figment of trauma. Weeks later in the village pub, the old landlord Arthur listened to my story. He nodded, eyes dark with old knowledge. "You're not the first," he said. "This has happened before." He told me the legend of the barefoot man, a spirit doomed to wander the moors, seeking shelter he was once denied. On stormy nights he knocks, asking for kindness. To refuse him invites his rage, to let him in is worse. He always takes one, and once he's chosen, there's no escape. 50 years have passed. I never returned to that cottage. Miriam was never found, declared dead years later. But I know the truth. She was taken by the raincaller. I've spent my life haunted by that night, unable to escape the fear. Even now, storms bring back the terror. Sometimes I think I hear it. A faint tap, tap, tap. Is it the wind or is he still searching? I warn others, if you hear a knock on a stormy night, remember my story. Do not answer. Do not open the door. Do not even speak. Some doors, once opened, can never be closed. Some visitors, once invited in, never leave. They simply take a piece of you, back into the rain and the endless waiting night. I bet you didn't know Romania hides one of the most haunted hotel rooms in all of Europe. The old brass key was cold and heavy in my hand, its teeth worn smooth from years of use. I stood before the door marked 313, the faded gold numbers barely visible in the dim hallway. Every instinct screamed at me to leave, but curiosity pulled me forward. The hotel was a decaying relic, isolated and battered by rain, the air thick with dust and a metallic tang. I pushed the key into the lock. It groaned, then clicked open. A wave of unnatural cold hit me as the door swung inward, revealing a pitch-black room. I flicked the light switch. A single bulb flickered to life, casting a sickly yellow glow. I stepped inside, crossing the threshold into the heart of the legend. The lobby was a cavern of shadows, furniture shrouded like sleeping ghosts. An old man sat behind the desk, his eyes pale and unblinking. He watched me in silence as I signed the guest book, his hands gnarled and unmoving. He slid the heavy brass key toward me, but held it tight for a moment. "Room 313, he rasped. "The last guest did not stay for the morning coffee." His warning was chilling, final. He released the key, melting back into the shadows. No directions, no help, just that ominous seed of doubt. As I climbed the creaking stairs, I felt his eyes on my back. The story was waiting for me, and the hotel seemed eager for its next chapter. The cold in room 313 was unnatural, my breath visible in the weak light. Sparse, dust-covered furniture filled the space, a wardrobe ajar, a cracked mirror, a thin blanket on the bed. Above the bed, a dark, rust-colored stain marred the ceiling, pulsing in the flickering light. The air was stale, the window painted shut, and the silence felt heavy, as if the room itself was holding its breath. I touched the mirror, felt a strange vibration, a low hum. Every object seemed wrong, broken or out of place. The feeling of being watched was overwhelming, the silence thick with anticipation. I set my bag down, the sound echoing unnaturally loud. This was no ordinary room. It was a place soaked in tragedy. I braced myself for the night ahead. Night fell, the storm raging outside as dread grew inside room 313. I lay on the bed, staring at the stained ceiling, the bulb flickering, shadows twisting. Then I heard it, a faint whisper, not from outside, but from within the room. The sound was everywhere and nowhere, a ghostly conversation just out of reach. I paced the room, checked the door, pressed my ear to the walls. Nothing but cold silence. The whispering grew clearer, a woman's sorrowful voice rising from the darkness. Suddenly, right beside me, a cold breath on my neck. "Are you still awake?" I froze, paralyzed by terror. The voice was real, in the room inches from my ear. I was not alone. Terror rooted me in place until a loud creak snapped me back. The wardrobe door swung open, revealing only a single wooden hanger, swaying as if pushed by invisible hands. My instincts screamed to run, but I grabbed my camera, desperate for proof. I filmed the hanger, then panned across the room. On playback, my blood ran cold. A translucent woman appeared near the bed, watching me. I looked up. The space was empty. But on the screen she lingered. The air grew colder, the sense of being watched unbearable. I kept recording, heart pounding, as the room seemed to close in. The legend was real, and I was living it. The nightmare had only just begun. I replayed the footage, the ghostly woman appearing closer each time. Then, drip drip drip, a wet sound from above. The stain on the ceiling had spread, now oozing thick dark liquid onto the bed. The smell of blood filled the room, nausea rising in my throat. I scrambled away as the dripping quickened, the blanket beneath turning crimson. The camera showed the woman standing beneath the stain, her head tilted up, her form flickering violently. The whispering returned, louder, her voice a mournful wail echoing the dripping blood. The room was bleeding, the past seeping through the ceiling. I was trapped in a nightmare, terror closing in from all sides. The evidence was undeniable. This was no ordinary haunting. The sorrow in her voice was overwhelming, a cry for help that would never be answered. I realized escape might not be possible. Exhaustion finally overtook me, and I collapsed into a nightmare-filled sleep. Dawn crept in, the storm gone, but pain burned on my arm. 3 deep scratches marked my skin, fresh, bleeding, impossible to explain. Panic surged. The entity here was not just a memory, it could touch, it could harm. I grabbed my things and fled, not daring to look back. The old man waited in the lobby, his eyes knowing. "She does not like visitors," he said, then told me of the murdered woman, her spirit trapped by violence and fear. I left the hotel, the story echoing in my mind. But you can't outrun a memory. Even now, I wake to faint whispers and see the scars on my arm. A part of me never left room 313.
Some nights when the world is quiet, I hear it. A soft, low hum, coming from nowhere and everywhere at once. It reminds me of a time I try to forget. Long, dark hallways, locked doors, and a scream that could wake the entire school. They say memories fade, but mine follows me, waiting in the silence. The hum is a warning, a story with no end. I was just a girl then, sent away to a boarding school, St. Jude's School for Girls. The place was beautiful, but sadness clung to its old stone walls and twisted trees. At night, the wind whispered secrets not meant for the living. I learned one of those secrets. A nun who took a vow of silence, died, and still walks the halls, searching for a voice. The memory always begins with a sound, a low, gentle humming at 2 a.m, the witching hour. At first I thought it was the wind or old pipes, but it was a melody, a sad tune for the lonely. At St. Jude's, loneliness was a constant companion. I'm telling you this as a warning. Some things are best left alone. There are doors that should never be opened, silences that should never be broken. If you ever hear a soft humming in the dead of night, do not seek it out. Do not call out to it, cover your ears, pretend you hear nothing. Because if you break the silence, you will hear the scream. And once you hear the scream, you will never know true silence again. It will echo in your memory forever. This is how it began. This is how the silence found me, and how it might find you. My parents sent me to St. Jude's when I was 14, deep in the hills of Kerala, India. The school was an old British relic, its dark stone soaking up the sun, leaving the inside cool and dim. By day, laughter and lessons filled the air. By night, the school changed. The nuns were strict but kind, teaching us discipline and faith. The old chapel was the heart of the school, beautiful but forbidden after dark. The doors locked at sunset, no exceptions. Older girls whispered that the chapel was not safe at night, that something old and sad lived within. My dormitory was in the oldest wing. The floorboards creaked, the wind rattled the windows. From my bed I could see the chapel's silhouette, a place of secrets. My roommates, Priya, Anjali, and Sita, had been there for years. They knew the rules and the stories. On my first night, Anjali whispered, "If you hear anything strange, don't get out of bed, just pretend to be asleep." I asked what she meant. She just said, "You'll know it when you hear it." The others stared at the ceiling, faces pale in the moonlight. A cold knot of dread formed in my stomach. Behind the prayers and gardens, something waited for the clock to strike 2. I didn't know it then, but I was living in a haunted house. And the haunting was just beginning. On my third night, I The humming was just the beginning. The scream was still to come. Curiosity and fear gnawed at me until I cornered Priya behind the library. She finally whispered the truth. "It's Sister Agnes." Sister Agnes had taken a vow of silence, never speaking a word, only humming as she worked in the chapel gardens. One day, she vanished. The nuns searched everywhere, but she was gone. A week later, a terrible smell came from the locked chapel. They forced the doors open and found her, dead, hands clasped in prayer, face frozen in terror, mouth stretched as if trying to scream. The official story was an accident, but the girls whispered otherwise. The doors had been locked from the outside. After her death, the humming began at 2 in the morning, and the cold presence haunted the halls. Priya's voice trembled as she told me, "Her spirit is still here, bound to the chapel she loved, still silent, still humming." The story explained the fear that gripped us every night. The ghost of Sister Agnes was real, and she was not at peace. The humming was her only voice, but we all feared what would happen if she ever found another way to speak. The silence was her prison, and we were trapped inside it with her. The legend was no longer just a story. It was our reality, and the haunting was about to break free. We could feel it in the air. The scream was coming. The humming continued every night, but after hearing Sister Agnes's story, it became terrifying. The cold in our room grew worse. Sometimes we'd wake to find our window wide open. Fear was suffocating. We were pale, sleep-deprived, jumping at every sound. One night the humming was louder, closer, right outside our door. The air was ice cold. My teeth chattered. Then came a faint scratching from the chapel, slow, rhythmic, like fingernails on wood. Suddenly the humming stopped. The silence was heavy, full of dread. And then it came, a scream, not human, but pure agony and terror, ripping through the night. It echoed through the school, a shriek of despair that felt like it was inside our heads. Every light flickered on, doors slammed open, nuns shouted, girls cried. The scream faded, leaving a ringing silence more terrifying than the noise. We huddled together, shaking and sobbing. We knew what we'd heard. It was not a prank. It was not the wind. It was Sister Agnes. She had found her voice. The vow of silence was broken. The haunting had changed. The ghost was no longer content to hum. Now she could scream, and we would never forget the sound. The school would never be the same. The silence was shattered, and the terror had only begun. That night was chaos. The nuns tried to calm us, blaming the scream on an animal, the lights on a power surge. But we knew better. The scream came from the chapel. We spent the night in the common rooms, too afraid to return to our beds. Priya whispered, "She was trying to get out." At dawn, the headmistress gathered us, forbidding any talk of the incident. She announced the chapel would be sealed off for repairs. But we knew the truth. They were trying to contain the ghost. As we returned to our rooms, we saw fresh, deep scratches on the chapel door, as if something had clawed from the inside. A workman was already boarding it up, his face grim. The school was erasing the evidence, but we had seen it. We knew the truth. The haunting was loose. The silence was broken. And nothing could put it back. We were marked by what we'd heard. And the ghost was not finished with us. After the scream, the school changed. The humming stopped, but the silence was worse. Cold, watchful, full of dread. Girls saw fleeting shadows, faces in windows, lights flickering out. Cold spots grew more frequent, more intense. Angeli woke with fingerprint-shaped bruises. Sita had nightmares of suffocating silence and a face with no mouth. We were being targeted. The spirit was reaching out. The nuns grew stricter, patrolling at night, forbidding us from even looking at the boarded chapel. But the haunting had spread. One evening I felt a blast of arctic cold near the chapel, a presence behind me, a cold touch in my hair. I was paralyzed with fear, unable to scream. After an eternity, the cold receded. I ran back to the dormitory. I didn't tell the others. They saw it in my eyes. The ghost had touched me. The silence was inside us now. We were haunted, even in the daylight. The school was no longer a sanctuary. It was a prison of fear, and the ghost was everywhere. We could not escape her presence. The silence followed us, and it would never let us go. My parents sensed something was wrong. I begged to come home, and finally they agreed. The knowledge I'd soon leave was the only thing that kept me going. My last night was the worst. I lay awake, staring at the boarded chapel, feeling dread. Just after midnight, a soft tapping came at our second-floor window. We all sat up. There was nothing outside but air. I turned to look and saw a face pressed against the glass. A woman in a nun's wimple, eyes wide with sorrow. It was Sister Agnes. But where her mouth should have been, there was only smooth skin. She stared at me, her mouthless face pleading, her hand pressed to the glass, frosting it over. Her expression begged for something. Release, a voice, help. Then her face contorted, her non-existent mouth stretching in a silent scream. We shrieked. The face vanished. The tapping stopped. The cold was gone. We huddled together, waiting for dawn. I knew I had to leave. I had to escape that place. But I knew the haunting would follow me. The silence was inside me now, and the ghost's face would haunt my dreams forever. I would never forget what I saw, and I would never be the same. The silence had claimed me, and it would never let go. My father picked me up the next morning. I didn't look back as we left St. Jude's behind. I never told my parents the truth. Who would believe a story about a humming nun and a face with no mouth? Years have passed. I live in a noisy city now, grateful for the constant sound. But sometimes, late at night, when the city sleeps, I hear it, a faint, low humming. My blood runs cold. I pull the blankets up, just like I did in that haunted dormitory. I don't know what happened to Priya, Angeli, or Sita. I hope they found peace. But some things you can't forget, some screams you can't unhear. The ghost of Sister Agnes is a part of me now. The chill on a warm day, the sudden silence in a crowded room. I escaped St. Jude's, but I never escaped her.